I want to introduce you to someone who has meant a tremendous amount to me. My life has been enriched by his existence. I thank God for the blessing of his birth, and his name is Dr. Wayne Dyer. Wayne, thank you for being on the show.
It's great to be with you, Bob. Thank you. It's an honor for me as well. I appreciate all of your kind words.
Well, it's been amazing to watch you grow so publicly over the years, from your very first book, Pulling Your Own Strings, and I remember absolutely delighted to watch you on the Johnny Carson show. Was that back in the 60s?
No, it's the 70s.
In the 70s.
76. So actually, my first book was Your Erroneous Zones,
Uh-huh.
and Pulling Your Own Strings was my second book in 78.
Okay, and now here you are. The two latest books of yours that I have read is There's a Spiritual Solution to Every Problem and Wisdom of the Ages. How would you characterize the difference between your earliest books and your latest books?
Well, I think I was. The best way I can answer that is to talk about one of my great teachers. His name was Carl Jung, and he said that when you become an adult, you go through developmental stages the same way that you go through developmental stages when you're an infant. You go from being a helpless infant to a pre-toddler to a toddler to a pre-adolescent and adolescent and so on, and then you reach adulthood. And a lot of times people think that developmental stuff stops, but Jung said that there are four archetypes that we go through as adults, and I think my writing has reflected those. The first he called, and the lowest, is called the archetype of the athlete. And it's the time in our adult life when our primary emphasis is on our body, how beautiful it is, how strong it is, what it looks like, how its hair is combed, and all of these kinds of things. A lot of looking in the mirror behavior. And then he said the second archetype is what he called the archetype of the warrior. And this is a time in our adult life when we take our bodies out into the physical world to do what warriors do, which is to conquer and to defeat and to collect and to get as much as we possibly can, and to set goals and think about ourselves and plan for our future and so on. He said if you're still traveling and still developing and moving psychologically and spiritually, he said the third archetype is what he called the archetype of the statesman or the stateswoman. And this is the time in our adult life when we stop saying, what are my quotas? We stop saying, what's in it for me? And we begin to ask, how may I serve? And what are your quotas? And what may I do for you? It represents a very dramatic shift. And ultimately, he said the highest archetype is what we call the archetype of the spirit, where you begin to understand what Jesus meant when he said you're in this world, but you're not of this world, and that you're really not a human being here having a spiritual experience. It's the other way around, that we are all spiritual beings here having a human experience. And I think my earlier writings reflected my traversing through those earlier archetypes, those lower archetypes of the athlete and the warrior. I was writing about psychology. I was writing about how to manage your emotions. I was writing about how not to be victimized and so on. I think they were a very important time in my life and important books. But then I began to shift and began to ask the questions in my own life, how may I serve? And my ego became less and less dominant, and what my accomplishments were and how well I was doing shifted into how can I serve? And my last books, particularly, There's a Spiritual Solution to Every Problem and the 10 Secrets for Success and Inner Peace, both of which have been the subject of public television specials and have been all over the country, reflect my moving into that world of spirit.
Well, I have, and we've talked on this show about something called the Kabbalah, and I know you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
I've studied that as well. And, Kabbalah talks about how life sort of conspires to lead us on that journey, to lead us through those transformations, that we get exactly what we need in life to make that next step. A lot of people, when those problems arise, they think that those are terrible things because it seems to bring an end to a stage, but those really become doorways to the next stage. Do you see it that way too?
I do. Well, it's the old notion of when one door closes, another door opens. And the Kabbalah, is very profound. In fact, it's the basis of some of the work that I'm doing now in a book I'm going to start writing in the fall, tentatively called The Power of Intent. And intent, to me, is perhaps the highest level we can reach. And I don't think that intent or intention is something that we do. Intent, I believe, is a force in the universe. And when you use the word the universe conspires, it's really like, I remember when I was growing up as a kid in Detroit, they had the trolley cars. I don't know if you remember trolley cars or not.
Sure.
but they had on these trolley cars or on these street cars, they had these straps that would hang down from the ceiling, and you would just sort of hang on to them, and we called them trolley straps. And I always think of intent as being like up there in the ceiling, just above, quite a bit above you, but hanging down. If you can get a hold of intent and hang on to it, you can let it take you wherever it is that you have an intention to go. Because inside each and everything that is alive on this planet, or ever has been alive, there's an intent. There's a future pull. You take a little pumpkin seed and you plant it, and you never get a watermelon. You know, you never get an orange tree. You always get the intent of that seed. And you look at a blossom on an orange tree, and it will become an orange. And there's an intent in there that I believe is the same in us, that we are also, you know, we begin with a tiny little seed. Even before that, we begin with the energy that creates the seed. And there's an intent there as well, but we often lose sight of it because we put our attention on our own goals and our own ego, and we separate ourselves from that intent. And I'd like to help people to see that intention, and it's a good thing. This is a show about parenting. It's a good thing to remember every time you look at one of your children, is that when they came into this world, as the great poet Khalil Gibran said, when you are born, your work is placed in your heart. I mean, there's an intention to everything on the planet, and we oftentimes start to program our children and start to tell them what they should be, or you should be what I think you should be, or what your father before your grandfather was, or whatever. And instead of letting them, you know, one of these 10 secrets for success and inner peace that I talk about is, I call it, don't die with your music still in you. I don't think there's greater advice you can give your child. And, you know, listen to the music that you hear yourself playing. It doesn't have to be the music I hear. And don't get to the end of your life. I don't know, have you ever read Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich?
Yes, I have.
You remember at the end of that book, he was an accountant in Moscow. At the end of that book, he's lying on his deathbed, and every day of his life, he just sort of did what he was programmed to do, what other people thought he should do. Mm-hmm. And there he was lying on his deathbed, and he looked up at his wife as he was dying, and he closed his eyes, and he said, "What if my whole life has been wrong?" Oh. And I thought, that always sends a shudder through me, even when I say it now on the radio.
Well, it's beautiful. I actually recently heard a teacher saying that he had a conversation with a woman who came up to him after one of his talks, and she said, I just wanted to let you know I've been married for 50 years. And right when he was about to congratulate her, she said, and they've been 50 miserable, rotten years. Uh-huh. You know, you bring up an interesting point, but, you know, when you talk about the power of intent in Kabbalah, from my studies, I've seen that as representing the highest principle called the crown. It is the highest principle on the Kabbalah tree of life. And I've done a show here called on Spiritual Parenting, where we actually bring those principles into life. And I know Miriam Montessori also talked about this, a great visionary of child development, that it's the parents and the teacher's role to try to discover that intent that is within the child and to cooperate with that as opposed to opposing that.
Yes, to become a facilitator of it instead of becoming someone who interferes with it and doesn't allow it to manifest. I wrote a book years ago, I don't know if you've ever seen it, back in the 80s, called a parenting book called What Do You Really Want for Your Children? I
love that book.
Yeah, I did too. It was a book that actually wrote itself. I've always been very, very proud of that book.
It's a great book on parenting. It's called What Do You Really Want for Your Children, right?
Right.
And it's still out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was based upon the principles of Maslow and self-actualization. Like when you ask parents, we did surveys of parents and asked them what they want for their children. Hardly any of them say they want them to be doctors, or they want them to make a lot of money, or they want them, to get into a certain occupation or whatever. They always talk to them about they want them to be happy. They want them to have a sense of purpose. They want them to be free from, unhappiness, free from disease. They want them, most of the thing. It's always surrounded about around their well-being as human beings. And yet most of our attention that we place in our parenting efforts are, as I speak to educators all the time, I always say to them, as you're dealing with young children every day, ask yourself this question in your own life. And anybody listening right now, ask yourself this question: what is more important at any given moment in your life? Is it what you know, or is it how you feel? And if you're really honest with yourself, you realize that when you're feeling bad, that's the first thing that you take care of. And it doesn't matter whether you can solve the rhyming scheme of an Elizabethan sonnet, or whether you know how to solve quadratic equations, or whether you know the capital of New Mexico. What you take care of first in your life is how you feel. And then ask yourself, how much of your attention as an educator and as a parent, how much of it do you place on helping a child to be able to grow up in this world and always feel great and feel happy and feel fulfilled and feel purposeful in their lives, and then make your shift off of the things about what do you know, like which is what almost the entire emphasis on our school education is about, and onto how you feel.
Well, that brings up so many issues. I mean, because, what I get from your work, especially all of your work really, but these last two works of yours that I've studied deeply, The Wisdom of the Ages and The Spiritual Solution to Every Problem, they really take a person on an inward journey where you begin to discover that so much of our attention is wasted focusing on controlling what is going on around us instead of drawing on that infinite power that's within us. And I think that, even when it comes to parenting, I think that the greeting that every parent needs to say to their child is, the sacredness in me salutes the sacredness in you.
Right, that wonderful Sanskrit word, namaste.
Namaste.
Yes, which is exactly what it means. That when I was going through some advanced training with a great teacher in India, he used to say to me that when you address another human being, no matter who it is, whether it's a child who's asking you for an autograph at one of your talks, or whether it's someone who's cleaning up the restroom in an airport and they address you, or whether it's someone who's making a sandwich for you at a restaurant, or whatever it is, everyone that you address, always address them with a title of respect. And that title of respect in your language, he said, is yes, sir, or no, ma'am. And he said, get in the practice of always using those terms, yes, sir, or no, ma'am, no matter who it is you're addressing. Because he said, it isn't that you are elevating somebody else above you or giving them a title that makes them more important than you. You're not addressing the form. You're not addressing the body. You're not addressing what they've accomplished in their life. You are addressing the unfolding of God, the unfolding of spirit that is in every single living creature, and particularly every human being that you address. So that essence that is within each and every one of us deserves to be talked to with a great title of respect, so that it reminds you that you are talking to not this being, whatever happens to be their station in life, or their age, or their size, or their color, or anything like that. You are addressing God, the God that is within each and every one of us, the force, the source of all things. And that became a habit of mine maybe 20 years ago. And a lot of times I'll be at a talk, and a 13-year-old boy will come up, and he'll hand me this, and I'll say, yes, sir. And he'll look at me like, and I said, I'm not talking to what you see. I'm talking to the unfolding of God that is in you, and it's the same unfolding of God that's in me as well. So it always deserves a title of respect.
Well, even going back to the philosophy of Kabbalah, when you do elevate another person with respect, you elevate the whole universe.
That's a great point, Bob.
Yeah, and it's, but our listeners now are struggling with, what if I'm dealing with somebody, and now we're going to get into some of the practical stuff, Wayne, of maybe Spiritual Solution to Every Problem, that great book of yours that's out in hardcover right now. What if I'm experiencing a deep level of disrespect for someone? Someone hurt me, and I'm feeling stuck in a place of, I don't respect this person. What's your advice to them?
They said of Jesus, and they said of St. Francis, and they said of Moses, and they said of Buddha, and they said of Muhammad, and when they've done the research on their lives, that when they would walk into a village, just their presence in the village and nothing more would raise the consciousness of everyone around them. And they represented a very high and a very spiritual energy. This book that you've referred to, There's a Spiritual Solution to Every Problem, is based upon a very powerful and important prayer. And I don't think of it as a religious prayer. I think of it as an 800-year-old technology that was originated by St. Francis of Francesco, for whom we named the city of San Francisco. And he was a little monk who many called, the greatest saint who ever walked among us. And what he would do when he would, when the teachings of Patanjali preceded him by over 1,000 years and 300 years before Christ. And Patanjali said this. He said, when you become steadfast in your abstention of thoughts of harm directed toward others, all living creatures will cease to feel enmity in your presence. And that's very, very important and powerful words. If you can get to a place where you never have a thought of harm, of hate, of anger, of anguish, of fear, of anxiety, of stress, of depression, you don't have those thoughts, that when you encounter someone whom you disrespect or someone who is operating at a very low level, because people ask me this question a lot, how do you deal with people who bring my energy down? And I suggest to them that the only reason they bring your energy down, if they get angry at you, if they become hateful or spiteful in your presence, is because you join them in their energy level.
Right.
You respond to that energy with a counterforce.
Right.
And your counterforce of anger is more anger. You're angry at them for being angry. You hate them for hating you. You are upset with them for being upset with you.
Let me see let me just interrupt you just for a second, because
Sure.
I've been burning to ask you this question from the beginning of the interview. And I want to see if I got this, because this one simple thing I got from your book is so powerful that it literally has changed my life. And it's this: when you have a problem, whether it's feeling disrespect for someone, or you're worried about finances, or about health, or about a relationship, the solution is not to continue to try to work on the solution. The solution is to work on getting yourself into sort of a higher, more balanced, harmonious state. Is that
exactly. It's Mother Teresa put it this way. She said, every conflict you have is not between you and them. It's between you and God. And the meaning and this is where I was headed with that whole harangue that I was giving you before. The idea is that you want to be able to, instead of responding to force with more force, to anger with more anger, which will drag you down, is what you want to do is respond to it with a higher level of energy. It's like in the prayer of St. Francis, he says, where there is darkness, let me bring light. Now, darkness is a lower and a slower energy than light. When you're in a dark room and you're about to light a candle, you don't have to warn the darkness and say to the darkness, you're going to have to scurry, you're going to have to get out of here because I'm going to bring some light in here. When you bring light to the presence of darkness, you not only send the darkness away, you convert the darkness to light. And that's the whole idea, is that he says, where there is hatred, let me sow love. That's one of the chapters in this book. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Each one of those represents a higher, faster, more spiritual energy that you bring to the presence of these things that we call problems or difficulties or disrespectful people or people who are angry or hateful toward us. And the lives of the great spiritual masters have always demonstrated to us, send love in response to hate. Send pardon in response to injury. And when you get your consciousness elevated to such a degree that a man named David Hawkins writes about in Power versus Force, when you get yourself above a calibration level of 600 on a scale of 0 to 1,000, that all living people who enter into your energy field will automatically be healed. And a Mother Teresa was someone, for example, who calibrated above 600. And I remember her walking into the room where I was speaking no, I wasn't speaking, but we were both on the same radio show in Colorado, or in Arizona, and the energy of the room changed. When I walked into the room where Mother Mira, who calibrates at above 700 in Germany, this Indian lady, everyone in the room had a sense of calmness and peace, because her energy was something that counteracted and counterbalanced the lower and slower energy of those around her. That's what you have to learn how to do.
Yeah, and your book definitely, there's a spiritual solution to every problem, definitely guides us in that process.
That's the whole purpose of that book. And the other one that we're talking about here is 10 Secrets for Success and Inner Peace. The last secret in there is wisdom is avoiding all thoughts which weaken you. So I earlier talked about not dying with your music still in you. Another one of these very important and powerful lessons that I have been talking to young people about for years and years is this whole idea of understanding that if you want to call yourself a wise person, look at the kind of thoughts that you have, and that every thought that you have has an energy that can be absolutely measured now. And if it's a thought of shame, it will weaken you. If it's a thought of hate, if it's a thought of fear, if it's a thought of anger, these are all thoughts which will literally weaken the very muscles of your body. They can do tests on these through kinesthesiology. And when you learn how to shift those thoughts into thoughts which will empower you, then you bring that energy to the presence of your family, of your children, of your community, of the world. And when enough of us reach that critical mass, what they call phase transition in physics, then we will literally begin to transform the entire planet.
So one of the skills to work on for ourselves and for children is something we might call energy consciousness, is to be aware of how our own power is being affected by our thoughts, feelings, speech, and actions.
Well, sure, you know that when you're around someone who is angry, when you're around someone who is hateful, when you're around someone who is judgmental, that you generally feel worse about yourself. You feel worse for the experience, you feel weaker, you feel drained, whereas you're around someone who's empowering and has a very high energy level, you feel empowered because they are not trying to take your energy away, they are sustaining and providing energy to you. And it's like if you go to a lecture where someone is, and you walk out feeling better about yourself and about life and so on, generally it's because that person has a very higher energy. If someone's up there haranguing at you and yelling and screaming at you and telling you how terrible you are, you feel weaker for the experience, and as a result, you will impart that kind of negativity. You'll have a counterforce to that. So it's always like looking at not only the energy that is around you, but the energy that you select for yourself. And particularly the great tests are when you do encounter lower energy, when you encounter hatred, when you encounter depression, when you encounter worry, when you encounter fear, that you don't respond to it with the same kind of energy, but instead you elevate yourself and you ask yourself, you go within. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago from a great teacher of mine, Abraham Maslow, he used to say that when you are having a problem and you are thinking of a problem, any problem that you're thinking of, he said, for 15 seconds, just think of God, whatever God means to you.
That's what one of the things that really helps me is when I'm encountering one of those problems, whether it's feeling discouraged within myself or dealing with a person who I'm finding difficult, I just find myself hearing God say to me, I'm here. And it's like I see God between me and that other person, and I begin relating to that force, and it seems to change things. And, if we were in a higher level of consciousness, I wouldn't have to say we're almost out of time. But we are really came to the end of this show, and it went so fast, Wayne, and it's been such a great experience for me, and I hope our listeners got out of this a higher level of energy as a result of listening to what you've had to say. And I know that I'm feeling a lot more energy than when I started this interview. And anyone who's even tempted to right now sit around and think about a critical way of viewing this show, what you've heard, just watch what that criticism does to you. Watch how you affect your state. And I'm sure, Wayne, that you probably agree with that.
I do. It's why I'm so proud to be on these kinds of shows, because this is what you're on the radio, and radio is energy. And there's invisible waves out there, and it comes into people's car antennas, it comes into their homes, it comes in over the internet. All of these things are energy potentialities. It's why I've invested so much of my life into public television. They think I'm raising money for public television. I'm just raising consciousness and using those frequencies to do that. And that's why I do these kinds of shows.
And make sure you look for our guests, Wayne Dyer's books. There's a spiritual solution to every problem, Wisdom of the Ages, and what's the last name of that?
10 Secrets for Success and Inner Peace.